Hello, welcome to Sustainability in Your Ear, the Earth911 podcast. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, and today we're joined by Bernie Lee, who's a Commodities Research Analyst for the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries, ISRI. They're a sponsor of the site. Bernie just recently published an editorial in Scrap Magazine called The Service, Value, and Labor of Recycling, in which he called out a number of important issues about the changes in recycling happening due to the Chinese trade policy, but also highlighted the fact that it's really what goes on in the neighborhood right there at the curbside that is the face of the recycling industry, and it's underappreciated, in many cases undercompensated, because people don't recognize the value. In fact, he says it's a service that provides a public good. But unfortunately, scrap as a product devalues and sometimes ignores the service recyclers provide to the community by collecting and processing recyclables. So, Bernie, welcome to the show, first and foremost. Tell us, in your opinion, what's the current state of the recycling industry in the United States because of the limitations on Chinese exports and the falling prices that have resulted from it?
Well, Mitch, thank you for having me, and I really appreciate that you recognized this aspect of recycling that's often overlooked. I think your question is a very complex question when it comes about the globalization of the scrap recycling industry. Mm-hmm. So when we think about, ISRI's stance, and I think it is a very reasonable stance, is that recycling is a part of the manufacturing supply chain. It closes the loop for materials that still have an inherent value. Mm-hmm. And part of that value is that it creates a common good for the people. Now, many times when we hear in our discussion about capitalism or socialism, is that oftentimes there's confusion about public goods, public commons, and what is oftentimes usually boils down to what's called the free rider problem. Is that right. A public common is oftentimes utilized by people who pay the least for it. Same thing with a public good. And so what happens here is that that when it comes to these materials, there was an inherent value to these materials that, it overcame the cost of reprocessing the material because of its environmental benefits and the amount of energy that was saved in using it. Now, this works when energy costs are high. Right. And so you need to reduce the amount of energy in order to do so. It also works when the cost of labor is high, and so that when the cost of labor is low, so that the reprocessed materials can still go back into the stream. But there's a difference in the valuation of items, and that's where this problem kind of results, and why globalization in some ways has exacerbated the problem, but also allowed for certain systems to sustain themselves for as long as they have.
The systems that have sustained themselves do seem to be struggling right now, and that's a combination of the single stream curbside pickup and the MRFs being essentially resorting what had been sorted to the curbside. Is that something that we need to be looking at as a challenge to wrap
yes,
around?
Absolutely. It is a challenge. It is definitely a challenge, and part of that challenge is because the system is not part of a vacuum. You can't it's hard to when people look at sustainability, oftentimes they're trying to control outside factors that really are not cannot be controlled for. They can't be assumed will remain the same when other things change. So what has happened is that, of course, the single stream recycling system was perfectly sustainable as long as there was a supply of labor that was cheap enough in order to process the materials, as well as available space with which to sequester any unusable materials or materials that had an even higher processing cost. And so this becomes a scale of diminishing returns. We want to catch, the cost of recycling, of being able to capture 30% of the recyclable materials out of a waste stream is relatively low compared to the return. Mm-hmm. So the cost is low, but as soon as you try to raise that another 30%, the cost usually more than doubles. And hopefully the value of those materials will be more than enough to compensate for that, but it does squeeze the margin. And then if you try to go from the 30% to the 60%, the costs have more than doubled, but the return has not, so you squeeze that margin. And then when you go even further, let's say another 10%, it's going to get even harder and harder, right? So as this gets harder, we needed labor costs to remain low in order to make that profitable. And those labor costs were found in other markets, and particularly in this case, China.
Right.
China has a low enough labor market cost that in many cases it's even cheaper in terms of some agricultural goods to source the agricultural good in the United States, send it over to China for processing, and then resell it to in the United States. So that labor cost, though, with an import ban that was put into place due to environmental reasons, it skewed the valuation of what's the environmental cost of recycling, what's the labor cost of recycling, what are these different valuations that are involved. So oftentimes, when the system has been revamped or just altered so significantly, and people have to reassess the valuation of how much recycling is worth to them, they want to keep certain things the same, but yet this is no longer a vacuum again, and so this global marketplace affected it. It facilitated single stream to make it cost effective, but now that it's gone, it's no longer cost effective. So with
the Chinese recyclable import ban, which is really a set of new limits that are just much more strict in terms of contamination. One of the things that I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, is the price of processing the recycling is going up here in the States because they have to slow down the sorting at MRFs in order to be more careful. They previously were outputting about 20-25% contaminated materials, and they need to get it down to 0.3%. So essentially, by slowing down the conveyor belt, you have people working twice as long if they've slowed it by half, and so therefore the price goes up. We're also in a full employment economy, and so there's a lot of contention for different kinds of workers and their time. What's a fair value for a recycling worker in this marketplace? And I can give you an example where I am in Pierce County, Washington. It's about $32 to $34 an hour. Are we talking about good middle class jobs that could be populated by people working in recycling in the future?
Well, I think once again, it's trying to make that valuation on an absolute number amount or a dollar amount is kind of difficult because when you look at the landfilling costs for Washington State and around Washington State, some of those will vary depending upon the municipalities. Right. And then even regionally, landfilling in the Pacific Northwest is generally much more expensive than it would be in the Mississippi Delta region. So that cost-benefit analysis oftentimes breaks down in terms of what's affordable and so forth. Right. Then there's the energy cost and the transport of movement of these things. So bear in mind that not only is that MRF that has to run the tonnage or run their conveyors slower, having to have a raised labor cost, because that conveyor belt is moving slower, its output is also reduced. Right. And because its output is reduced, then that acts as another multiplier to the cost. So I'm thinking, but let's dial this back for a second. Let's think about what happened in the Northeast, for example, during I think it was about 2-3 years ago when there was a heavy snowfall in the Northeast of the U.S. And I think Boston, Buffalo, they were all they were under so much snow, and there was a public health hazard because the hauling trucks couldn't even move through the roads to pick up trash for weeks. Mm-hmm. So the people felt that this is a service that oftentimes they took for granted because they pay for it in their water bill and so forth. Right. But No, the service was no longer there, and there was no. How much would you have to pay in order to get somebody who would be willing to trudge through the snow, grab those bags, and take them away from you?
Yeah,
you know,
like you're saying, a public good is not recognized till it's gone.
Absolutely, and those costs become, once they become kind of assumed, there's always this idea that the market stays the same, and that's not necessarily the case. Like I said, the labor value or the labor cost for this sort of recycling in the residential curbside aspect of the industry was found in a different market. Now, environmental costs have become more apparent to the consumer, and so people are more concerned about it. It's raised its value, and because it's raised its value, other country markets such as Indonesia and Thailand and Vietnam, and even maybe and parts of South and Latin America, Central America, they're going to have to consider the environment as part of their cost of doing business, and they don't want to ruin that as well. It hurts tourism. It hurts a number of other revenue sources for them. That's going to be a difficult puzzle to solve.
Absolutely. Like you said, my question at the beginning is complex because right now we're looking at all of this as problems to be solved in the future when they are present issues that we have to deal with today and had not expected. So now ISRI, which is the largest industry organization in scrap recycling, has proposed some changes to the infrastructure. Can you give us a couple of examples of how we can start to change the infrastructure here in the United States?
We have to be careful about characterizing the problem to its regionality. Urban areas, rural areas, areas where transportation costs are high and where they're low, and where there is the road network for moving goods. So in the Midwest, for example, you have large train networks that allow the movement of goods to be improved. So I think that the infrastructure that's necessary is that we need to have a community effort that's tailored to each community. And that's one of the infrastructure investments that I think that we need to look at. We need to see CART programs improved that work for their communities, pickup schedules that work in where they are. You can't have the same type of CART program in a suburban area outside Indianapolis, Indiana, as you may in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., or the suburbs of Austin, Texas. There are other factors that have to be considered. Also, the amount, the consumption habits of these areas, because the coastal regions used to have export markets very readily available to them because of the availability of shipping lines from those ports. Now, in the central United States, they might not be feeling it as much because they had to cover the transport costs just to get it to those places.
Right. But
then again, transport costs in the United States are going up is because truck space availability and freight, those are all costs that are going up. There is a dearth of available truck drivers in order to meet the need of freight demand in the United States. The number of train lines have been cycling down because they were utilized less. So all of these things in consideration, it's the labor of moving these things. That's why I feel like the most important aspect that we have to recognize is that this is where the value is in recycling, and that that the consumer needs to understand. You are paying for having somebody take stuff.
I completely agree. I've been looking at this. I've been looking at this question of how do we take care of recycling, and often the cost is so hidden that we don't think we're even paying for it today. But you're hitting on something.
You were mentioning infrastructure investments, and I think CART programs was one of those things that ISRI has also advocated. But I think we also need an educational infrastructure investment in the sense that we need to reinform the consumer about what is and isn't recyclable on a regional level. And that is, it may not seem as a building project, but it is something that we need to capture the hearts and minds, and that's a sort of, I guess, an abstract infrastructure
to build a culture of recycling that is embedded in our physical world as well. And so what you're describing from, to use some other industries as examples is an edge network problem. Right now, we have a very centralized approach to recycling, just as we had a very centralized approach to, for instance, electricity and television until very recently. And now you can see that at the edge of the network, consumers are choosing lots of different alternatives rather than having to pick from 1 to 3 to 5 options. And ultimately, if we have local solutions that are locally enabled, as you're saying, the community has a particular set of problems and they have to configure their waste and recycling streams to address it, we're in a great position to start to reinvent the infrastructure.
Absolutely. And I think that's, it's about the consumer choices that will inform how our manufacturing supply chain will adjust to those needs. Mm-hmm. And if recyclables have a value, then the purchase of materials that contain recycled content is extremely important. Just because it's recyclable doesn't mean that it's sourced from recycled material. And right. So that's a very careful distinction that also needs to be highlighted, so that the labor of recycling is not just in the knowing where to put it in the bin, but how you consume products in order to promote those products that recycle themselves well. I would like to add one last thing, though, is
sure.
that some of these costs oftentimes are, we can think of the short-term steps. I think of the plastic straws that people are trying to find alternatives for. And I think that while well-intentioned, sometimes we have to be very careful about the economic consequences of this. Yes. of our actions. And so it's oftentimes we think of a simple solution that we want to have move the needle, and unless we know its volumes and relationships to the market, sometimes it's very, it can be very difficult. And so we have to think that, and so I want people to consider that while there is a service, the service is not cheap. But it is valued, and to show that value, and that diminishing returns are just part of it. But But as long as we work together for a future goal, that we can make improvements in that way.
Well, you are singing the Earth911 song for me. I'm so pleased to hear you say that. That's what we're trying to do every day. ISRI is also doing a great job in terms of getting education out and working with our regulators. Thanks very much for joining us, Bernie Lee. We would love to have you back to talk about this more on sustainability in your ear.
Absolutely.
Folks, this is Sustainability in Your Ear, the Earth911 podcast, and we'll be back next week.